The beast was not a monster of myth, born of Greek tragedy or Old Testament wrath. It was flesh, blood, and 85 tons of scarred, slate-gray malice. It lay still in the water, the mid-Pacific sun glinting off a hump that rose like a sleek, wet island, its blowhole puffing a fine mist into the humid air. 85 feet away, the men in the fragile cedar whaleboat froze, their harpoons raised, their breath caught in throats parched by salt and adrenaline. They had hunted hundreds of sperm whales before. They knew the routine, the chase, the strike, the Nantucket sleigh ride, the flensing. But this one was different. This creature was not fleeing. It was thinking. And for the first time in the history of the American whale fishery, the prey decided to become the hunter. What followed was a disaster so improbable, so horrifying, and so steeped in irony that it would haunt the American consciousness for a century, shattering the Quaker stoicism of Nantucket and proving that civilization is a very thin veneer, easily stripped away by hunger, thirst, and the unforgiving silence of the sea. To understand the horror of the Essex, one must first understand the world that built her. The year was 1819, and Nantucket, a crescent-shaped sandbank off the coast of Massachusetts, was the oil capital of the world. Before the drill bit struck ground in Pennsylvania or Texas, the world was illuminated by the oil of the sperm whale. It burned brighter, cleaner, and sweeter than anything else. Nantucket was the Middle East of its day, a place of immense, quiet wealth, governed by the pious, pacifist Quakers who, despite their gentle speech and plain dress, were the most ruthless hunters on the high seas. The Essex was an old ship, small and blackened by years of oil and blood, but she was considered lucky. When she slipped her moorings in August 1819, headed for the Pacific grounds, she carried 21 men. Among them was Captain George Pollard, Jr., a 29-year-old first-time captain burdened by the weight of command and the shadow of his ambitious first mate, Owen Chase. The voyage began with omens that a superstitious crew might have heeded. A squall knocked the ship onto its side just days after leaving port, nearly sinking them before they had even crossed the Gulf Stream. They lost 2 whaleboats, crucial tools for the hunt, but Pollard, anxious to prove his worth and fearing the shame of a return to port, pressed on. They rounded Cape Horn, battling the furious winds at the bottom of the world, and sailed into the Pacific. For over a year they hunted with moderate success, filling the hold with barrels of precious oil. But as the coastal grounds dried up, they made a fateful decision to sail westward into the vast, uncharted emptiness of the offshore ground, thousands of miles from the coast of South America. It was a desert of water, a place where a ship could sail for months without seeing land or another sail. On the morning of November 20th, 1820, the lookout cried out, "A pod of whales." The crew launched the remaining whaleboats, leaving the Essex manned by a skeleton crew. First mate Owen Chase harpooned a whale, but the beast's tail struck his boat, shattering it. Forced to cut the line, Chase returned to the Essex to make repairs. While he hammered canvas over the broken cedar, the cabin boy noticed something off the bow. A massive bull sperm whale, roughly 85 feet long, the largest anyone aboard had ever seen, was lying quietly on the surface, its head pointed toward the ship. Without warning, the whale moved. It didn't dive, it accelerated. With a terrifying rush of water, the Leviathan slammed into the port side of the Essex. The impact was like a cannonball strike. The ship shuddered violently, men were thrown off their feet, and the sound of cracking oak timber echoed like a gunshot. The whale stunned itself, floating dazed alongside the hull for a moment before swimming off. Chase, stunned, began to order the pumps manned, assuming it was a freak accident. But the whale was not done. It turned, hundreds of yards away, and snapped its jaws, a sound clearly audible to the terrified men. Then, catching the sight of the ship, it charged again. This time it swam at full speed, its massive, flat forehead acting as a battering ram. It struck the bow of the Essex with cataclysmic force, driving the ship backward through the water. The oak planking, reinforced to withstand ice and storms, shattered like glass. The whale disengaged and vanished into the deep, leaving the Essex rapidly sinking, her bow crushed. In 10 minutes, the ship capsized. The crew, including Captain Pollard, who had returned from his own chase to see his ship destroyed, scavenged what they could. Navigational tools, a little bread, some water, and a few tortoises they had collected from the Galapagos. They were 3,000 miles from the coast of South America. They were in 3 small, leaking whaleboats, open rowboats less than 30 feet long, 20 men, minimal food, and the Pacific Ocean, a vast, indifferent killer, stretching endlessly in every direction. A council was held on the floating wreckage. Captain Pollard proposed sailing for the Society Islands, modern-day Tahiti, which lay downwind to the west. It was a logical choice. The winds favored it, and the distance was manageable. But Owen Chase and the second mate, Matthew Joy, dissented. They possessed only vague rumors of the Pacific Islands, stories of savage cannibals who feasted on shipwrecked sailors. Ironically, terrified of being eaten by savages, they convinced the captain to sail east and south, against the wind and currents, toward the coast of Chile or Peru. They chose the route of civilization, the longer, harder route. It was a decision that would seal their doom. They feared imaginary cannibals so much that they embarked on a journey that would turn them into the very things they fled. The first month was a slow torture of exposure and attrition. The sun blistered their skin during the day. The nights froze them to the bone. Saltwater sores ate into their flesh. Thirst became a physical weight, pressing on their minds. They drank their own urine, only to find it made the thirst worse. Then, a miracle. They spotted Henderson Island. It was a small, uplifted coral atoll. They rushed ashore weeping with joy, finding fresh water in a spring and nesting birds to eat. But the island was a trap. The water source was tidal and limited. The birds were quickly depleted. Realizing they would starve if they stayed, the decision was made to leave. However, 3 men, Thomas Chappell, Seth Weeks, and William Wright, chose to stay behind, preferring to take their chances on a solid rock rather than the open sea. The remaining 17 men piled back into the boats on December 27th, sailing away from the only safety they had known, leaving their comrades waving from the beach. Now the horror truly began. The boats drifted into the doldrums, the windless band of the ocean. Supplies ran out. The bread was wet and salty. The tortoises were gone. One by one, the men began to die. First it was the second mate, Matthew Joy. His body was sewn into his clothes and committed to the deep, a traditional burial. But as the days turned into weeks and the hunger became a ravenous, maddening beast, the social contract aboard the boats disintegrated. When the next man died in Owen Chase's boat, the survivors looked at the emaciated corpse not with sorrow, but with a feral, desperate calculation. There was no discussion of burial. They separated the limbs from the body, cut the flesh from the bones, and roasted the meat on a flat stone at the bottom of the boat. They ate their shipmate. It was the crossing of a threshold from which there was no return. The meat gave them strength, but it marked their souls. They had become the cannibals they had sailed thousands of miles to avoid. In the confusion of a storm, Chase's boat was separated from Pollard's and the third boat. Chase's men continued their grim drift, rationing the human flesh, their eyes hollow, their humanity stripped away until they were merely biological engines seeking fuel. But the situation in Captain Pollard's boat was descending into an even deeper circle of hell. The third boat, under the command of Hendrickson, disappeared entirely in the night, never to be seen again. Pollard and his remaining men were alone. The food ran out again, but this time no one had died of natural causes yet. They were staring at each other, starving, knowing that for the group to survive, one had to die. They did not wait for death, they invited it. They decided to cast lots, a Quaker tradition usually reserved for dividing land or property, now perverted for the selection of a sacrifice. Scraps of paper were placed in a hat. The lot fell to Owen Coffin, the teenage cousin of Captain Pollard. Pollard, who had promised the boy's mother he would protect him, cried out, my lad, if you don't like your lot, I'll shoot the first man that touches you." But Coffin, perhaps broken by the ordeal or resigned to the inevitability of fate, rested his head on the gunwale and whispered, "I like it as well as any other." They drew lots again to see who would be the executioner. It fell to Charles Ramsdell, Coffin's young friend. The horrific intimacy of the act is almost impossible to contemplate. Amidst the vast silence of the Pacific, with a pistol pressed to his friend's head, Ramsdell pulled the trigger. Owen Coffin was butchered and eaten by his cousin and his friend. The act kept them alive, but it shattered Pollard. He had failed as a captain, failed as a protector, and had consumed his own kin. 90 days, that is how long they drifted. 3 months in an open boat. On February 18, 1821, the British brig Indian spotted a small, tattered boat bobbing in the swells. As they pulled alongside, they saw 3 skeletal figures, Owen Chase, Benjamin Lawrence, and Thomas Nickerson. They were surrounded by gnawed human bones. They were barely human themselves, their skin black with the sun, their eyes wild. 5 days later, the American whale ship Dauphin spotted another boat. Inside were 2 men, Captain Pollard and Charles Ramsdell. They were found gnawing on the bones of their shipmates, clutching them possessively, unwilling to let go even when rescuers offered them bread and water. They had survived, but they had brought the graveyard with them. The aftermath was a quiet tragedy. The survivors were reunited in Valparaiso. They told their story, a confession that horrified the world. The 3 men left on Henderson Island were miraculously rescued near death, having survived on shellfish and rainwater. In total, 8 of the 21 men survived. 7 of them had eaten human flesh. The legacy of the Essex rippled through American history. Owen Chase returned to Nantucket, wrote a narrative of the disaster, and tried to live a normal life, though he was plagued by headaches and hoarded food in his attic until his death, eventually declared insane. Captain Pollard was not so lucky. He took command of another ship, the 2 Brothers, which promptly wrecked on a coral reef. Marked as a Jonah, a bad luck captain, no owner would trust him with a ship again. He spent the rest of his life on Nantucket as a lowly night watchman. Years later, a young writer named Melville visited Nantucket. He met the old broken man, George Pollard. Melville later wrote that he had exchanged a few words with Mr. Pollard, and to him the captain was the most impressive man, the most wholly humble, even to me, whom I have ever encountered. Pollard's tragedy, the white whale's fury, and the descent into madness became the soul of Moby Dick. But the reality was far starker than fiction. Ahab died fighting the whale. Pollard lived to remember the taste of his cousin's flesh. The story of the Essex is more than a maritime disaster. It is a terrifying testament to the fragility of man's dominion over nature. The Americans of the 19th century believed they were the masters of the earth, ordained by God to harvest the seas. The whale that struck the Essex shattered that illusion. It proved that underneath the wooden planks of civilization, deep within the human heart, lies a primal darkness waiting for the lights to go out. The Essex didn't sink. It descended into the raw, violent truth of survival. A truth that Nantucket and America tried to forget, but which the ocean remembers forever. The rescue was not the end of the horror. For many of the survivors, it was merely the beginning of a different kind of haunting, a transition from the physical hell of the open ocean to the psychological purgatory of memory. When Captain Pollard and Charles Ramsdell were hoisted onto the deck of the Dauphin, they were not cheering, they were catatonic. The sailors of the Dauphin were seasoned men, hardened by the brutal trade of whaling, yet they recoiled at the sight of the boat's bottom, where the splintered, sun-bleached bones of their shipmates rolled with the swell. Pollard and Ramsdell, their stomachs distended and minds fractured, had to be physically separated from the remains, clutching them with a protective feral jealousy. They had survived by consuming the dead, and in the delirium of starvation, the dead had become their only possession, their only sustenance, their only certainty. It took days of gentle care, spoon-fed broth, and the darkness of a cabin to bring them back from the edge of madness, but the feral glint in their eyes would never fully extinguish. While Pollard and Chase were being nursed back to health in Valparaiso, the fate of the three men left behind on Henderson Island hung in the balance. Thomas Chappell, Seth Weeks, and William Wright had watched the boats disappear over the horizon months earlier, resigning themselves to a slow death on their desolate coral rock. They had exhausted the island's bird population and drained the small spring. Desperation drove them to dig deep wells into the sharp coral with their bare hands in search of fresh water, often finding only brine. They survived on the blood of seabirds and the few berries they could scavenge. They had prepared shallow graves for themselves, writing their names on crude wooden crosses, waiting for the end. On April 9, 1821, nearly 4 months after the Essex crew had departed, a ship appeared. It was the Surrey, an Australian merchant vessel commanded by Captain Thomas Raine. Raine had been informed of the castaways by the rescued survivors in Valparaiso and had agreed to search for them. When the Surrey's boat approached the beach, the three men stumbled out of the brush, skeletal, weeping, and unable to speak. They fell to their knees in the sand, thanking a god they believed had forgotten them. They were the only Essex survivors who had not resorted to cannibalism, a fact that would grant them a strange, quiet dignity in the years to come, sparing them the dark whispers that followed their shipmates. The return to Nantucket was the final crushing act of the tragedy. In 1821, the island was an insular, tight-knit Quaker community where everyone was related by blood or marriage. When the survivors stepped off the ferry, they did not return as heroes. They returned as ghosts. The silence that greeted them was deafening. Captain Pollard bore the heaviest burden. He had to walk the cobblestone streets to the home of his aunt, Nancy Bunker Coffin, the mother of the boy he had sworn to protect and the boy he had eaten. The encounter is unrecorded in history books, but the oral traditions of Nantucket describe a scene of biblical sorrow. Pollard reportedly told her, "I have lost my boy," to which she replied in grief-stricken fury that she could never forgive him. Pollard, once a rising star of the fleet, was a broken man. The Quaker community, known for its collective support, essentially ostracized the survivors in a polite, frigid manner. They were living reminders of what lies beneath the surface of civilized men. Despite the trauma, the sea was the only life they knew. Astonishingly, almost all the survivors went back to whaling. It was a necessity of economics, but perhaps also a need to conquer the element that had nearly destroyed them. Owen Chase, the first mate whose narrative would become famous, was driven by a manic need to succeed. He became a successful captain, known for his speed and ruthlessness in the hunt. He drove his crews hard, filling his ships with oil in record time, as if trying to prove that he was the master of the ocean. But the cracks in his psyche were deep. Later in life, the trauma resurfaced with vengeance. Chase began to suffer from severe headaches and nightmares. He developed a pathological fear of starvation. In his retirement, he began hiding food in the attic of his Nantucket home: crackers, biscuits, dried meat, hoarding supplies against a famine that would never come. He was eventually declared insane, dying in 1869, his mind finally drowning in the memories of the boat. Captain Pollard's attempt at redemption was even more tragic. The owners of the Essex, perhaps out of pity or a belief that lightning doesn't strike twice, gave him command of a new ship, the Two Brothers. 2 years after the Essex disaster, Pollard was back in the Pacific. In a cruel twist of fate, the Two Brothers struck a coral reef during a storm and sunk. Pollard survived, but his career was over. No owner would insure a ship under his command. He was branded a Jonah, a man cursed by God. He spent the remaining decades of his life on Nantucket, not as a captain, but as the night watchman. Every night, the man who had commanded ships and survived the worst ordeal in maritime history walked the dark, quiet wharves, lighting the street lamps for others, a solitary figure carrying a lantern against the gloom. It was here, on a cold November evening, that Herman Melville met him, a brief encounter that left the author awestruck by Pollard's immemorial sadness. There was one other survivor whose voice remained silent for over a century: Thomas Nickerson, the cabin boy. He was only 14 when the whale struck. He had seen the worst of it, huddled in the bottom of the boat while men were butchered. For decades, Nickerson ran a boarding house on Nantucket, never speaking of the Essex. He wrote his own account late in life, at the urging of a writer, but the manuscript was lost, buried in a trunk in an attic in Connecticut. It was not discovered until 1980, 106 years after his death. Nickerson's account provided a grittier, less polished, and perhaps more honest view than Chase's published narrative. He described the sheer terror of the boy he was, the weeping at night, and the pivotal moment when the whale struck, noting that the beast seemed possessed by arch malice. His silence during his lifetime was the silence of a man who knew that some truths are too heavy to share with a world that sleeps safely in its bed. The story of the Essex eventually faded from the headlines, eclipsed by the gold rush and the Civil War, but it remained a dark stain on the American maritime soul. It marked the beginning of the end for the golden age of Nantucket. The sperm whales, hunted relentlessly, became scarcer. The discovery of crude oil in Pennsylvania in 1859 rendered whale oil obsolete. The great fleets rotted at the docks. But the Essex endured in myth. It challenged the prevailing 19th century doctrine of manifest destiny, the idea that nature was a resource given by God for man to exploit. The Essex proved that nature was not a passive treasury. It was a sleeping giant, capable of waking up and exacting a terrible revenge. The legacy of the Essex is not just a story of survival, it is a story about the limits of human endurance and the terrifying adaptability of the human mind. It asks the uncomfortable question, what would you do? Sitting in a comfortable room, it is easy to judge the men who drew lots and ate their kin. But placed in a leaking boat 3,000 miles from land, with the sun beating down and the madness of thirst setting in, the line between civilization and savagery vanishes. The Essex survivors did not return as monsters. They returned as men who had seen the void, and the void had looked back. Their story remains a warning from the past, drifting like a ghost ship on the horizon of history, reminding us that the sea is deep, the night is long, and we are not as much in control as we like to believe. The story of the Essex did not merely end with the death of its survivors. It seeped into the ink of American literature, transforming from a maritime tragedy into a modern myth through the mind of Herman Melville. While the survivors were living out their quiet, haunted lives on Nantucket, the narrative of their ordeal was circulating in the wider world, a dark whisper in the forecastles of other whaling ships. In 1841, 20 years after the disaster, a young Herman Melville signed on to the whaler Acushnet. During a GAM, a mid-ocean meeting between two ships, Melville met the son of Owen Chase. The young man handed Melville a copy of his father's narrative of the most extraordinary and distressing shipwreck of the whaleship Essex. Melville later wrote that reading the book while only miles from the very latitude where the Essex was struck had a surprising effect on him. The reading of this wondrous story upon the landless sea, and so close to the very latitude of the shipwreck, had a surprising effect on me, he admitted. The image of the avenging whale seized his imagination. However, Melville made a crucial distinction in Moby Dick. In his novel, Captain Ahab is a monomaniacal tyrant seeking revenge on a beast. In the true story of the Essex, Captain Pollard was a passive, decent man, crushed by a beast that seemed to be exacting revenge on him. The reality was far more terrifying than the fiction because it lacked a villain. There was no mad captain, only a mad situation. The whale in Moby Dick is a symbol of evil. The whale in the Essex story was simply nature fighting back, an act of biological defiance that human arrogance could not comprehend. While the literary legacy grew, a separate silent mystery remained in the wake of the rescue: the fate of the third boat. When the three whaleboats had separated in a gale on the night of January 12th, the boat commanded by Second Mate Matthew Joy, and later by Obed Hendricks after Joy's death, drifted into the void. It carried William Bond, Joseph West, and three others. Unlike Pollard and Chase, who were eventually found, Hendricks's boat vanished utterly. For years, rumors swirled. Had they capsized? Had they been eaten by sharks? Or had they too succumbed to the custom of the sea? Years later, a grisly discovery on the island of Ducie, east of Henderson Island, offered a chilling clue. A visiting ship found a whaleboat washed ashore with 4 skeletons inside. The identification was never confirmed, but the location and the timing aligned with the drift of the lost Essex boat. If these were indeed Hendricks and his men, their end was even lonelier than that of their comrades. They had drifted onto a barren rock, only to die of thirst, their boat becoming their coffin, undiscovered for years, their bones bleaching in the same sun that had tormented them in life. It serves as a grim reminder that for every survivor's story told, there are silences that hide even darker truths. To fully grasp the nightmare the men endured, one must look beyond the narrative and into the physiology of their suffering. The human body is not designed for the open ocean. As the days turned into weeks, the men of the Essex were not just hungry, they were undergoing a chemical disintegration. Dehydration is a terrifying way to die. As the water level in the blood drops, the blood thickens, becoming a sludge that the heart struggles to pump. To maintain blood pressure, the body constricts capillaries in the skin, turning the survivors pale and gray. The brain, roughly 75% water, begins to shrink, pulling away from the skull, causing blinding headaches, the kind Owen Chase suffered from for the rest of his life. But the most insidious effect is hypernatremia, salt poisoning. In their desperation, some men drank seawater. The kidneys cannot process water with such high salinity. To flush the salt out, the body strips water from its own cells, accelerating dehydration. This leads to hallucinations, delirium, and aggression. It explains the madness described in the journals, the moments where men would suddenly stand up and scream or speak to loved ones who weren't there. When they finally resorted to cannibalism, they were seeking protein, but what they desperately needed was water. Ironically, raw human flesh contains a significant amount of water, and it was likely the hydration from the blood and flesh of their shipmates as much as the calories that extended their lives. They were drinking the lives of their friends to sustain their own. The physiological horror was compounded by the psychological torture known as survival guilt, a concept not defined until the 20th century, but lived vividly by the Essex crew. In the Quaker theology of Nantucket, everything happened by the will of God. Prosperity was a sign of God's favor. Disaster was a sign of his displeasure. For Pollard and the others, the question was not just, how did we survive? But why did God punish us, and why was I spared while he was taken? This spiritual crisis destroyed Pollard. He could not reconcile his survival with his faith. He had eaten his cousin. In his mind, he was a marked man, a sinner of the highest order. This internalized shame is why the story was suppressed in Nantucket for so long. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a scandal. It suggested that the pious, God-fearing men of the island were, when stripped of their coats and Bibles, no better than the savages they looked down upon. The silence around the Essex was finally broken not by a whaler, but by history itself. As the 20th century turned into the 21st, a new generation of historians, led by Nathaniel Philbrick, dusted off the old journals. They pieced together the meteorological data, the ocean currents, and the sociological makeup of Nantucket. What emerged was a portrait not of villains, but of victims of a perfect storm. We now understand that the offshore ground where they were struck is a zone of immense biological richness, a breeding ground for sperm whales. The bull whale was likely a dominant male defending his pod during mating season. The men of the Essex hadn't just stumbled upon a whale, they had intruded into a living room. The whale's attack was not malicious in human terms, it was a territorial defense mechanism, engineered by millions of years of evolution. Today, if you visit the Nantucket Whaling Museum, you can see the artifacts of this lost world. You can touch the harpoons, smell the faint, lingering scent of oil in the old casks, and see the jawbone of a sperm whale towering over the visitors. But the true artifact is the story itself. It has traveled from the decks of the Dauphin to the pages of Chase's journal, through the mind of Melville, and into the modern consciousness. The Essex tragedy serves as a permanent check on human hubris. In an age where we map the ocean floor with satellites and cross the Atlantic in hours, the story reminds us that the ocean is still a wilderness. It is indifferent to our technology, our morality, and our lives. When the waves rise and the coast disappears, we are all just 20 men in a leaking boat, praying that the darkness doesn't have teeth. The 85-ton bull whale that sank the Essex did more than destroy a ship. It sank the idea that man is the master of his world, leaving us drifting in the realization that we are merely guests in a universe that is vast, violent, and terribly, beautifully alive. For over a century, the story of the Essex was defined by Owen Chase. His published narrative, written just months after the rescue, was the version the world knew, the version that inspired Melville, the version that painted the survivors as stoic, if tragic, figures. But history has a way of unearthing secrets, sometimes long after the voices have fallen silent. The true end of the Essex story didn't happen in 1821, or even with the death of the last survivor. It happened in 1980 in a quiet attic in Connecticut. A grandnephew of Thomas Nickerson, the cabin boy, was sorting through an old trunk when he found a battered notebook. It was handwritten, fading, and tied with string. As he turned the pages, he realized he was holding a ghost story. It was Nickerson's own account of the disaster, titled "The Loss of the Ship Essex, Sunk by a Whale and the Ordeal of the Crew in Open Boats." Written late in Nickerson's life in 1876, he had sent the manuscript to a writer named Leon Lewis, hoping to have it published. But Lewis had taken the money and the notebook and disappeared. The manuscript had languished in obscurity for 104 years. Nickerson's voice, rising from the pages, was different from Chase's. Chase wrote like an officer, concerned with navigation, wind knots, and discipline. Nickerson wrote like the terrified teenage boy he was. He captured the emotional devastation that the adults had repressed. He described the silence of the nights, the sound of men weeping in the dark, and the crushing guilt of survival. He challenged some of Chase's details, recalling that the whale had not just struck them, but had eyed them with cool calculation. He revealed that on the boats, it was not always stoic prayer. There were moments of breakdown, of fierce arguments, of men losing their minds not just from hunger, but from the sheer existential terror of the void. The discovery of this manuscript changed everything. It humanized the legend. It reminded the world that these heroes were also victims, severely traumatized men who spent the rest of their lives trying to outrun the shadow of the whale. Nickerson ended his days as a boarding house keeper on Nantucket, a kind, quiet man who would sit on the Widow's Walk, staring out at the harbor, perhaps watching for a ship that would never come in. As the 19th century wound down, the industry that had sent the Essex to her doom began to die. The discovery of petroleum in Pennsylvania in 1859 was the harpoon that finally killed commercial whaling. The great fleets of Nantucket, once the lords of the Pacific, rotted at the wharves. The ships that had braved the Horn and hunted the Leviathan sank into the mud, their ribs exposed like the skeletons of the very beasts they had hunted. Nantucket transformed from an industrial powerhouse into a summer resort, its cobblestone streets trod by tourists who had no idea that the oil for the lamps of their ancestors had been bought with such blood. And what of the Essex herself? She lies there still, roughly 2,000 miles west of South America, just south of the equator, in the vast, abysmal plain of the Pacific. The depth there is immense. The pressure would have crushed her wooden hull long ago, scattering her iron trypots, her anchors, and her harpoons across the silt. There is no monument there, no buoy to mark the grave, just the endless rolling blue, the domain of the sperm whale. Today, marine biologists tell us that sperm whales possess distinct cultures, dialects, and memories that span generations. Some wonder if the memory of the stove boats exists in their songs. Did the whale that struck the Essex communicate its victory? Did the whales learn that the wooden parasites on the surface were fragile? We will never know. But we know that on that day in November 1820, the ocean drew a line in the sand. The story of the Essex concludes not with a period, but with a question mark. It stands as the ultimate fable of the Anthropocene, a warning that no matter how advanced our technology, how thick our hulls, or how confident our captains, we are always one strike away from disaster. The men of the Essex sailed out as kings of the world and returned as humble survivors of a universe they could not conquer. In the end, only the sea remains. It covers the tracks of the whale and the wake of the ship. It keeps its secrets in the deep, cold dark, rolling on as it has for millions of years, indifferent to the triumphs and tragedies of men.